Hello viewers, welcome back. I would like to apologize now if you notice or don't notice any quality changes. I am back to temporarily using my really old, really slow home computer that likes to shut down at random times. I have been doing everything through my laptop for a while, but I started this today and got the wonderful surprise that my microphone either wouldn't pick up any sound or it would echo so badly that it wasn't really worth recording anything. So I'm going to try to do this review through here and hope that I can get through it without any complications. Okay, so very early on in my anime reviewing career, I attempted to make a review for Hetalia. This was a very logical endeavor, as a few years ago the show was very popular. However, it wasn't to be. I actually recorded a few different versions of this review, but I couldn't find one I was satisfied with. My personal standards had begun to grow after the monstrosity that was my first review. Ultimately, this idea wasn't totally scrapped, but instead put on the back burner. Until now. So, where to start? I mentioned in one of my anime rambles, I'm pretty sure it was the very first one, when I was talking about why I prefer anime to American television. My main point there was that anime tends to have a more concrete story, because most of them follow, to some extent, the manga series they were based off of. The same cannot be said for a show like Hetalia. For those of you who don't know, Hetalia was based off of a webcomic that has since been discontinued. This was also the case for doujin work, but with that show they attempted to combine it all into a more cohesive storyline. When Hetalia was adapted into an anime, they didn't really change the format at all. The animated version is still a bunch of semi-random skits shoved into a bunch of 5-minute episodes. For that reason, it was a little harder to judge Hetalia like I judged the other shows I've reviewed. Because when there's no real original storyline to speak of, excluding maybe half of the Hetalia movie, the half that's not taken up by flashbacks, and the characters' personalities are based solely on the stereotypes of whichever country they're personifying, well, what else is there, really? So I had to look at this a little differently. To back up a little, I suppose Hetalia would technically fall into the historical fiction genre. As I just mentioned, the characters are all personifications of countries. The anime follows their interactions throughout different points in history, but in a way that has an almost solely comedic purpose. Of all the anime I've ever seen, from the really obscure stuff to the shows everyone talks about, this show more than any other is the one I would hold up as an example of the power of fandom. Originally, Hetalia's characters were comprised of almost exclusively the major players in the two world wars. The very first episode opens up on a world conference, showing a few other characters too, who don't really come in until later. Speaking of, the opening scene of Hetalia is one of my favorite openings to any anime, especially if you go through and watch it a few times so you can catch what all the characters are saying. It's not just that it's a really funny scene, it sets up the rest of the craziness that follows perfectly. But anyway, as I was saying, I feel like the cast grew with the fan base. More countries were given personifications as the Hetalia trend caught on in more places, and the fan base is impressive considering we're talking about a show that has none of the traits a good anime usually does. In fact, I cosplayed as Hungary to the first convention I ever went to, and we got there late because that was also the weekend my school was holding the PSATs, but that's another story. When we got there, they were having a Hetalia photo shoot out on the front lawn, and they could barely fit everyone in the picture. There were that many Hetalia cosplayers. So what is it that has drawn so many people into this show? Aside from the comedy and the shiny animation style, I do feel like Hetalia really has gotten so popular due to the representation. We live in a wonderfully self-deprecating world. The character stereotypes are extreme, but I haven't run into anyone who's ever been truly offended by them. This show has introduced me to stereotypes I never even knew existed, but people were joking about Americans being obnoxiously loud and self-absorbed long before Hetalia ever came into being. I really can only speak for my country, but these stereotypes are things that people almost take pride in, even if they're not exactly accurate depictions of themselves. As far as the history goes, I'm not going to suggest that you use Hetalia as your primary source for historical information, but the idea that you could actually learn something from this show isn't totally insane either. In my high school, our history courses were mostly focused on the history of our own country. This semester I took a World Civilizations course, which was much more focused on the rest of the world, and I was pleasantly surprised to learn that Hetalia actually did teach me a few things, like which countries are the Baltic states and generic information about alliances throughout the years. Like I said, I wouldn't use Hetalia as your main historical resource. Most of the truly educational pieces are only very briefly glanced over to make room for all the comedic craziness. But at the very least, I think it's safe to say that this show got anime fans interested in history in a way that their previous classes never did. But none of this is what really interests me in the Hetalia fandom. I don't want to over-dramatize this, but I feel like this show has gotten anime fans into the idea of world peace and embracing other cultures like never before. Speaking of my World Civ class, we've spent the past 2 or 3 classes discussing how nationalism played such a big role in starting both world wars, and to some extent, that pride in your nationality still exists today. It's the reason people were able to connect to these characters despite little to no character development. I feel like we were predisposed to like some of them, especially if you came from America, like I do, because I don't think I've ever known someone who has identified solely as American. Usually, if you ask an American where their family's from, they can break it up by percentages for you. For example, my grandmother was born in England. That's always been an important part of my heritage, even though I've never been there. Yet. So I would probably have a soft spot for England's character no matter what. The same can be said for the friend who participates in the Scottish festival each year, and the friend whose family actually takes off and celebrates St. Patrick's Day, even though neither Scotland nor Ireland plays too big a role in the show. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, because it's not exactly like I have to tell anime fans that people can get really attached to fictional characters, but personifying the countries has made people see all sorts of historical events in a different light. Though the show itself is, for the most part, really lighthearted and funny, most of the fan works are very serious and dark. With every new natural disaster comes an influx of fan art and fan fiction depicting how the other characters helped this particular country get back on its feet after a crisis. While some of these are just plain dark, as opposed to dark yet uplifting, they indirectly share the same message. And I see war shown this way even more so than destruction that no one can really be blamed for. No matter how justified the cause, people get hurt and families are torn apart, and it can be a lot easier for people to see both sides of a conflict when you can put a name and a face to each side like Hetalia has. And I at least don't feel like this has been done in a way that undermines reality. And like I said, I don't mean for all of this to come off in a really dramatic way, but more than anything else, this show connects people. I think the fact that Hetalia Day is set each year for the weekend closest to United Nations Day is proof enough of that. As a whole, I would definitely suggest you check out Hetalia if you haven't already, and watch it in English if you have the chance. Not that the original voicing is bad, but I feel like you're definitely missing out on all the crazy accents the dub includes if you watch it in Japanese, and it adds to the humor. Hetalia recently got approved for a 6th season, set to air sometime this year. Though each episode is short, I wouldn't feel pressured to watch all of them, though please feel free. My suggestion is just that if you somehow manage to avoid getting sucked into the Hetalia craze a few years ago, it is worth checking out, at least to get a taste of what drew in so many others. Thank you for watching.